gives this presentation, I would like to ask his close friend Dean Chatterjee to make an announcement in relation to Professor Bilgrami.
One quick announcement. Yesterday, Akeel didn't get a chance to eat anything since 11 o'clock in the morning. That long flight on Continental, they didn't even feed him peanuts. Forget about anything else. He had his first meal at 2:30 in the morning this morning. It so happened that yesterday also was his birthday. What a way to celebrate his birthday. Just want to let you know that.
Thanks for coming.
I'll start making signals if you want.
No, I'll be happy. Well, it's very nice to be here. Thank you for asking me. Political violence standardly presupposes conflict, and it's conflict that I will speak about. Conflicts in our own time, and prophesied self-fulfillingly for the future, have, in a familiar and tired hypothesis, been described in terms of a clash of civilizations. A lot of words have been written on this hypothesis since it was first formulated, a few, I almost regret to say, from my own keyboard. Today I want to argue first that, perverse as it may sound, there's health in conflict, though I will redeem some of the perversity by saying what I intend, that I intend that as a historically comparative remark. What I mean in particular is that, strange as it may sound, there is comparative health in the hostility of conflict. Since we are all obsessed with our relations with Islam these days, let me first begin with Islam. For centuries, the relations between European Christendom and Islam were vilifying in the extreme in word and violent in deed. Nevertheless, they displayed a respect for one another, trading in diverse material products, and engaged in a prolonged and fruitful mutual intellectual and artistic collaboration and influence. All of which, when viewed from the thoroughly revised circumstances of the last 200 years or so, can seem only enviably robust and healthy. For those many hundred years prior to the consolidation of Western colonial rule, both cultures were feudal and pastoral, and despite local differences in religious doctrine, which was in large part the avowed ground of the antagonism, there were shared intellectual premises that governed these differences. In fact, paradoxically, it is really the shared element which was the indirect source of the early hostility. The more ancient religions of the East, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, were not only more remote in space, but were intellectually too removed to be palpably threatening to Christianity in the way that Islam, with its many shared assumptions, was. The Crusades were thus fought less in the cause of recovering the cross for Palestine from some altogether foreign emergence, more to eradicate the heresy represented by the Muslims in Arabian lands. Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and the British conquest of India, however, gradually gave rise to an era defined by a quite different tone of relations than hostility. Hostility was, of course, still there on both sides, but it was not the key to future relations. It was the new tenor of colonial mastery that mastery required attitudes of condescension, and were felt to be so by the subject people, breeding in them not so much a robust sense of hostility, but one of alienation and resentment. This new psychology that accompanied colonial relations was, of course, undergirded by an altering of the material relations which had held for centuries. The growing mercantile and industrial forces of the most powerful Christian lands were, as we know, steadily destroying the pastoral societies in their own terrain, but the effects on the lands and economies of their colonial subjects was altogether different. What feudal structures it destroyed to recreate new and vibrant economies in its own midst, it left well alone in these other lands, taking only what was necessary for its mercantile and industrial requirements. By transforming its own political economy while extracting surpluses but leaving structurally unchanged its conquered lands, European colonialism thereby laid the foundation for an abiding material differential, which would continue until today to be the underlying source of the ideological rhetoric of superior progress, not only material but also civilizational. The health of hostility, by more or less equal foes, had by these material agencies now deteriorated to the alienating effects of condescension and defensive resentment amongst increasingly unequal foes. Decolonization, though it once seemed an achievement, did not do much to change these relations, at least in Muslim lands, since it was followed by political domination and manipulation by the superpowers, as well as substantial economic control of one salient commodity by an alliance between foreign companies and the elites of client states, such as Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. More interestingly, since decolonization, the same set of problems began to be transplanted. Islam's theological vision had always presented itself as a world religion, and the Ottoman Empire had set out with considerable success to give that theological vision substantial practical instance for a very long period. But after the Second World War, Islam began to be a world religion in a quite different sense, one which made a vital difference to the life and politics of European nations. In the long aftermath of the Second World War, many of these were reconstructing economies devastated by it. Initially, the rebuilding of the industrial base and the service sector was able to absorb the population, but as the base grew and services needed fuller replenishment, there was seriously growing labor shortage in these countries, most especially in the more menial services to which local populations turned last or not at all. It was in this period, the 50s and 60s, that Britain, France, and Germany threw open their doors to immigration in order to cope with this shortage, and naturally the largest number of immigrants for the jobs that most needed filling were from the ex-colonies, or in the case of Germany, from Turkey, where economic conditions didn't always absorb their own local populations into fruitful employment. Very large sections of them were Muslims, and by the 70s this immigration was quite substantial. And since the immigration to a large extent consisted of illiterate and semi-literate populations from the countryside of these ex-colonies seeking to be absorbed elsewhere than the glutted metropoles in their own countries, and since they were finding employment in the least desirable jobs in the European nations, it became apparent that even after almost total decolonization, something rather similar to colonial relations between the same peoples was being replicated, only now inside of European nations, and not by conquest, but by immigration. The psychology of these relations became entrenched when once the labor shortages eased, local populations often resisted allowing the full and equal assimilation of migrant workers. So to many immigrants it seemed as if history had brought no progress. The colonized remained colonized, their masters too remained masters, it's just that the latter were now the natives and the former the outsiders. I've rehearsed these familiar historical points in order first of all to say that the clash of civilizations of which we hear so much today, unlike historically previous clashes, should be honestly recorded in genealogical terms as a conquest passing itself off as a clash. And second, in order to stress in the context of that genealogical understanding that Islam seems a renewed source of dignity and autonomy, not only in Muslim nations, but also for Muslim populations in Europe, where the marginalization and failure to be assimilated has reinforced long-standing feelings of helpless vulnerability. Identities are formed most strongly when the source of identity promises dignity and self-respect in the face of such a long and continuing sense of defeat, and the present rise of absolutist elements of Islam in Europe as well as, of course, in the Middle East and elsewhere is to a very large extent explained by this. In other writing, I've argued that there's no addressing nor avoiding the self-fulfillment of these messianic claims about the clash of civilizations if we don't locate the more productive forms of clashes that implicitly exist within civilizations. And I've argued that in the deepest analysis we have to acknowledge that the conflict within civilizations are of two very different kinds, and try and come to some comprehension of the relations between these two conflicts. The first conflict, speaking still of nations with large Muslim populations, is for the most part an implicit one between a small minority of absolutists, fundamentalists as they are sometimes misleadingly called, a small minority of absolutists and a far larger class of ordinary Muslims who have no particular desire to be ruled by strict Sharia law or to engage in an external jihad against the jahiliyyah imagined to have been perpetrated by the infidels of Western culture. ordinary Muslims who are too busy with their occupations and preoccupations to be motivated by any such fundamentalist commitments or fantasies. That's one conflict. And the second form of conflict, the first conflict is between a small minority of absolutists and a large class of ordinary Muslims. And the second form of conflict is of a psychological conflict within the heart of each such ordinary Muslim, between, on the one hand, his or her distaste for such extremist commitments, and, on the other, the defensive psychology against the West for past colonial subjugations, which continue today in revised but nevertheless recognizable forms. It has been my claim in those writings that even the simplest ideals of formal democracy, whose rationale is presumably to calibrate representation with numbers, would help greatly with the first of these conflicts, because, as I said, it's a conflict between the vast majority of Muslims and a small minority of extremists who dominate the political scene because they make the loudest noise, and the state, for statist reasons of keeping the peace, pays attention to the loudest noise and allows them to become the representative voice in society, even though they are a small minority. Democratization would have the effect of at least showing these groups to be exactly what they are, a shrill and unrepresentative minority, as it has always shown whenever there have been national elections in Muslim lands, at least in those Muslim lands where Islam has not been suppressed, as it has been in Algeria, for instance. In countries with already existing formal democracies, where Muslims are a minority, as in Europe or India, the problem is slightly different. Here, what is needed is democratization of communities, so as to once again bring to center stage the representative voices of ordinary, non-fundamentalist Muslims who are by far the large majorities within these communities. But we don't even have a theoretical toehold on how this may be done, since both in terms of theorizing in disciplines such as political science and in our institutional mechanisms, our focus has been almost entirely on representative institutions and processes, such as electoral processes, at the federal, regional, and municipal levels, but not at the site of communities. We haven't developed even initial or primitive ideas about how such a democratization of communities might take place, an appalling lack in these disciplines of political sociology and political science. However, it has also been my claim in those writings that no amount of democratization, even if it were somehow to be introduced, will help with the first sort of conflict between the absolutists and the large number of ordinary Muslims, unless the second sort of conflict, the one within the hearts of ordinary Muslims, the psychological conflict, is resolved in a particular direction. The fact is that the first sort of conflict is only an implicit one. Ordinary Muslims in these lands share none of the motives and commitments of the fundamentalists, but they have not explicitly come out and said so and opposed them. This is because within their own hearts they are conflicted between their distaste for the fundamentalist ideals on the one hand, and on the other, their defensive resentment of the West, which they associate with their colonial past and its present legacies that I mentioned earlier. And unless they resolve this conflict in a way that allows them to get over their defensive psychology, they will never allow their conflict with the fundamentalists in their own lands to become explicit, thinking that they would be just capitulating to what is demanded of them by a dominant West if they did so. The question of how one overcomes a defensive psychology of this kind is far more complicated than I can address here, but what I've tried to show at length elsewhere is that it could only happen if one climbs out of a predominantly third-person conception of oneself by which one constantly sees oneself as the product of historical and psychological causes, and adopts instead a more first-person or agential perspective towards one's future actions. In fact, I think it would be no exaggeration to say that the West has only one effective weapon to address the conflict it claims to be in against Islamic fundamentalism, and that is a psychologically undefensive population of ordinary Muslims who will make explicit what is now only an implicit conflict with the fundamentalists in their countries. It's the only weapon the West has. But for Muslims to empower themselves with an increasingly agential point of view requires social conditions that allow for a radically different moral psychology. I won't try to say what those conditions would have to be. It's a very complex question. But I will say that those conditions are not going to arise if ordinary Muslims are constantly witness to events such as the world's only superpower in bilateral agreements with the primary colonizing agent of the past 300 years, first bombs the hell out of a parched and hungry Muslim nation in October 2001, then invades and bombs another nation already devastated by an immoral embargo and lands it with a frenzied scenario of tribal rivalry and insurgent mayhem. I want to now quickly move to a quite different part of the canvas, from conflict within the minds of Muslims to a similar sort of conflict within the minds of ordinary Americans, and look also to the relevance of democracy in addressing this. It is well known that in polls for the first 2 or 3 years after September 11th, a large majority of Americans were in favor of waging wars against both Afghanistan and Iraq. And if there's some majority feeling against the Iraq war now, it is more out of a sense of being embroiled in a mess than out of a conviction of its intrinsic moral and political wrong. A lot of these warmongering attitudes are voiced with an overall conservative religiosity in the heartland of this country, not unlike what is found in Muslim populations elsewhere. How then shall we think of this? Well, I have to say, I was struck by how a lot of my friends on the liberal left are thinking about it, which can be summed up by a closing remark of an op-ed I remember reading in The Nation after the last national election, which the national federal election. The op-ed piece closed by describing the electorate of the so-called red states as vile and stupid. I say I was struck because it occurred to me that this sort of attitude is, on the face of it, simply incompatible with a belief in democracy. You simply cannot believe in democracy and dismiss the electorate of more than half of the country as a moral abomination. I asked myself if I really had such disdain for ordinary people's moral capacities, and I thought that there was a single person who had great moral judgment, why should I not prefer for my country an enlightened monarchy instead of a democracy? There seemed to be no obvious reason not to. Winston Churchill, whose thinking on all civil rather than military matters was feeble, is said to have pronounced that democracy was a terrible form of polity to adopt, and the only reason to adopt it was that all other forms were more terrible. But I don't get it. Why should one not choose democracy? Why should one choose democracy over enlightened monarchy if one thought ordinary people of the electorate to be vile and stupid, and thought a single man or woman to be of great moral judgment and worth? Perhaps Churchill and others who say things like that had in mind that at least democracy allows people the autonomy to choose their government, even if they consistently choose, with their vileness and stupidity, governments which wage wars, cut taxes for the rich, create a large handful of millionaires at the expense of millions of ordinary working people. But why should we fetishize such a species of autonomy, which reduces to a mere formal property if it should turn out that it will always, given the moral weakness of the electorate which exercises it, result in morally deplorable outcomes? We are faced then with a central paradox at the very heart of the idea of democracy, at least as central as the more familiar paradox of majoritarian tyranny. This is the paradox of how one can both believe in democracy and the indescribable moral badness of the electorate. The attitudes of the left liberal metropolitan intelligentsia, tempting though they are for the lazy mind, are, however, uncompulsory. And here too, the most fruitful theoretical strategy is to focus on internal conflict in the hearts of ordinary Americans. Let me explain. It would be useful to diagnose the situation here too in terms of why there is a failure of an explicit conflict to surface, just as we did with Muslim societies, where there was a failure of conflict to surface because of ordinary Muslim reticence about criticism of the absolutists with whom they share so little. The diagnostic answers here are, in a sense, much more obvious than the more subtle ones having to do with the defensive moral psychology. Very much more obvious. But we can approach the obvious by looking at a case far away. Take Saudi Arabia, in which even just 3 years ago there was hardly any explicit conflict within a docile population. Many factors, no doubt, were responsible for recent changes. But one most salient and dramatic factor was without a doubt the extraordinary impact of one television station on ordinary citizens, injecting conflict into Saudi Arabian society by the most basic service of providing information about just how much the country was run by a corrupt and self-serving state and its power elites. And this impact was not restricted to Saudi Arabia. The implications of this for how to diagnose the situation in the United States should be obvious. By contrast with Al Jazeera, the mainstream media in America, that is the media which is read and viewed by ordinary people who are too busy making a basic living to seek information out on non-standard sites, is cravingly unwilling to provide the most basic information about their government's actions and the consequences of those actions, not to mention the actions and consequences of the governments elsewhere that it supports. And the point is not just about media and information, but much more broadly and pervasively about subtle forms of internalization of pervasively orthodox and uncritical thinking on public matters from very early on in the mainstream educational institutions. This suggests the obvious point that ordinary Americans have all the moral strengths that ordinary people in Europe have or any other place has. Its weaknesses in comparison to other people is rather epistemic and not moral. In fact, I think one can state it as the first law of political psychology, that one cannot exercise such moral strengths that one has if one is pervasively, epistemically weak on information, and information not just in the narrow sense, that is bad enough, but also in the broader sense of having easily available in one's education alternative cognitive frameworks for thinking about politics, political economy, and public life more generally. What this in turn suggests is that we need to think of conflict in these contexts in counterfactual terms. That is to say, there is much scope for conflict even in the US today, and it may even sometimes be possible to describe things correctly by saying that there is latent conflict now, which would surface more if, counter to fact, full information, both in the narrow and the broad sense I mentioned, was available. A question might be raised about whether I'm not invoking here an implausible Marxian notion of false consciousness in which, say, in Marx, the proletariat's bourgeois aspirations were dismissed as a spurious state of mind on the grounds that such a class, by its objective historical status in a particular economic formation in a particular period of history, had revolutionary consciousness, its true consciousness, which was screened off from it by thick layers of falsifying ideology. Is this not the notion I'm assuming when I say that a belief in democracy requires us to say that ordinary people have moral strengths which in the case of the red states are screened off from them by layers of subtly internalized indoctrination early on by a pervasively orthodox education system and consolidated every day in their lives by the mainstream media? But I'm not assuming any such notion of false consciousness. First of all, I'm not claiming to possess an objective theory, such as historical materialism claimed to be, which says it is objectively true that people have such moral strengths as no matter what their behavior reflects. I'm not saying that. I'm only making a conditional claim. I'm saying that if you believe in democracy, you must have confidence in the underlying strengths of ordinary people, over and above the regard for their autonomy of choice. But quite apart from the modesty of my claim, I'm not claiming anything about the ordinary people who form the electorate of the red states, which is analogous to the hypothesis that a class has a certain revolutionary consciousness simply because of their historical role, even if their behavior shows them to have no such aspirations and only a keenness for mobility upwards in the middle classes. What makes my claim entirely different is an analysis which goes something like this. Rather than appealing to a historical theory about the nature of class, one can appeal to the most ordinary forms of evidence that social scientists seek. I think there are easily detectable grounds in the behavior of ordinary people in the electorate of the red states to attribute moral strengths to them, as well as the latent conflict that I have in mind. There are many such grounds, not least some of the inconsistencies which show up in polls. Thus, for instance, just to give one example, it's quite commonly the case that when questions in polls are put in terms of values that individuals hold, the answers go overwhelmingly in a humane and compassionate direction. But if formulated in terms of economic or foreign policy jargon on the very same issues, it goes in the opposite direction. Now, of course, one could say that the answer to the second sort of question is a sign that the answer to the first sort of question, the humane answers, were insincere. But that sort of cynical interpretation, to which I'm afraid many elite liberals are prone, is quite premature. It takes no account of what psychologists call the frame problem, which I believe is of obvious relevance here, because how one might think in different ways in different frames can help to explain the seeming inconsistency in these responses. And it seems perfectly apt to invoke the notion of epistemic weakness rather than of moral depravity to explain why people are often landed with different frames. The differential answers in polls suggest that when these people think and indeed act as individuals, they simply are not typically vicious and ruthless. And this is the side that is being addressed when the first sort of question in polls is presented. Call this the first frame. But the second sort of question presents itself to them in a quite different frame that addresses their minds not as individuals, but as they have been subordinated to institutional structures of state, corporations, and to the media and educational system that presents these structures to them, and then the answers are quite different, indeed quite inconsistent with the answers they gave within the first frame. But being in different frames, the inconsistency or conflict is not apparent to them. So once again, it's a matter of conflict, and once again, it is an implicit conflict. It is these distinct frames within which these responses are given that conceals the conflict from the very people who are responding to the polls. Being hidden from themselves, the conflict remains latent. And once we diagnose things in terms of this conflict, we can see that it is once again a perfectly healthy form of conflict which needs to be made explicit, and it allows us to retain our belief in democracy without any commitment to implausible notions of false consciousness. So the point of pressing concern then is how epistemic strength might be built up to make the moral strengths that ordinary people have flower in public and political life. And this implies the further question as to how to reconfigure the political conditions so as to help remove the boundaries between these distinct frames, so that there's only one frame and a latent conflict therefore becomes actual or explicit and resolves itself. Here too the answers are obvious. Since the epistemic weakness is due to the fact that the widely available media, and even to a large extent, as I said, the educational institutions from early on, have subordinated themselves through subtle forms of internalization to the corporate and state structures, it will have to be, this building up of epistemic strength, will have to be at quite non-standard sites at which these epistemic strengths can be developed. As Gandhi understood very well in the region of the world where I come from, when the effects of the media and education more broadly are so pervasive, the only non-standard sites where such strengths will emerge are the sites of popular movements. And since Gandhi's time, these have been strengthened by all the additional informational and communicative access to the internet and to electronic mail available to them, which was simply unavailable to popular movements of even 2 decades ago. It is popular movements so enhanced which will have to be the main sites of public education and public deliberation where epistemic strength is to be gained. There's a great and natural tendency in the intelligentsia of the United States and perhaps also in Western Europe to think popular movements as being at best peripheral and at worst dangerous. Just compare the number of books, articles, PhD dissertations, etc., that are written in sociology and political science departments on popular movements as compared to those on constitutions, elections, and all the more formal apparatus and institutional aspects of democracy. They are a fraction of them. Part of this tendency owes to an association of mass movements with extremism, an association that goes very deep in a culture which for over 200 years has been taught to be spooked by the Jacobin aftermath of the French Revolution. But in fact, in constitutional societies of the West, if anything, the opposite is true. When you have a mass movement, when you have to carry everyone with you, you're bound to have to moderate. This is a simple but often unperceived fact. Even a cursory look at the history of the civil rights movement makes this obvious. The scope for such movements holds promise for what I was calling the healthy form of conflict, a clash within civilizations, educating us all to make explicit the implicit psychological conflicts within our own minds and resolve them in the humane and civilizing directions we, as ordinary people, distant from the sites of power, are capable of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that wonderful presentation, Professor Bilgrami. Our next presenter will be Professors Ken Jameson and Polly Wiessner from the University of Utah. And there will be questions, question time later. But first we'll hear from Professors Jameson and Wiessner on failed states. Thanks.
Thank you. Polly and I are going to divide up the 20 minutes, and so I'll be stepping on her toes if I go over to 10 minutes. So when we saw the conference, we were quite excited about the links that we saw potential with both Martha Nussbaum's talk on the clash within the Hindu right and Amartya Sen's Violence and Identity. But after the talks, we at least I see all sorts of links with what we've been talking about before. Indeed, with the previous talk, we'll be talking about particular experiences with popular movements, and in one case, perhaps it is bringing epistemic strength in the case that I will use. In the case of Frank Salter, who talked about ethnic identity and how it links to violence and indoctrination to violence, we will be talking about related experiences with that. And even Tom Ferrer's talk about the liberal grand strategy we will be talking about, because we will be talking about failed states where there really is no grand strategy and how that plays out. And in those cases, the cases that we'll be talking about, we really have no viable state. There's been a reversion to tribalism. Slater quoted Walzer, "Tribalism names the commitment of individuals and groups to their own history, culture, and identity. It is permanent and must be accommodated." And that will be the kind of issue that we're dealing with in two countries. The tribalism that we will deal with is a tribalism in Papua New Guinea and in Ecuador. And the main contrast that we will make between those two is what that has led to in terms of violence. In the case of Papua New Guinea, which Polly will talk about, the horizontal competition among tribes for resources has devolved into a resurgence of violence and recently to what can be termed terrorism. In Ecuador, on the other hand, and I was hoping to have Frank Salter's map pull up here, but the computer turned off and locked, and so, but if any of you were here, he had a map this morning of violence, of insurrections. And if you went down the west coast of Latin America, you saw red in Colombia. You saw red in Peru. And there was this little place right here where it was brown, or whatever that other color was, beige, because there had been no violence, or minimal violence at any rate, no terrorism. And that's what I want to talk about. It's very nice for me to be able to talk about that because I'm an economist. And you know that we are the dismal science, and it is nice not to be dismal for a change, to talk a bit about a rather successful experience, that success being the indigenous movements in Ecuador. We locate the resurgence of tribalism in the failure of the state. And in particular, we locate it in a consistent and coherent attack on the state that we trace back to the 1980s that has been tied in with elements of globalization as well, which is playing out really throughout Latin America with the resurgence of populism, with an instability in the democratically elected governments. Probably the best example of that being Hugo Chavez, who took advantage of the complete disaccreditation, if you will, of the political parties to establish his regime there now. And in other cases, it is playing out in terms of a return to tribalism or to indigenous identity. So let me talk a bit about Ecuador. Ecuador received its independence as a country in 1830. And from 1830 on, there really was a process of colonizing the indigenous. They were never really incorporated centrally, but they were colonized and given a role within the state. And there was an ostensible homogenization that took place within Ecuador. However, with the attack on the state and the weakening of the state in the 1980s, we find that the state no longer could provide the means with which to buy people into it. It was, in some sense, was anticipating the kind of thing that Bruce Hoffman talked about at lunch with the third generation, where they're lowering expectations, where the possibilities really are not seen as very hopeful. This happened starting really in the 1980s in Ecuador with a deterioration in the macroeconomic performance, and it led to a search, if you will, at the micro level for alternative ways of defense, of self-defense. And the main one in Ecuador was a resurgence of an indigenous movement among the population, which, if you measure the indigenous, it would be between 6 and 45% of the entire population of Ecuador. This reclamation of the indigenous identity came about through a resurgence of cultural values and a creation of modern variants of traditional practices. The dress, a reclaiming of the dress, the traditional dress, the Quechua language, the bilingual education, traditional names, traditional myths were again reclaimed. All of these are elements that Frank Salter talked about this morning. It's important to note that in some sense they're being reclaimed, but at the same time they're being invented. We invited an indigenous woman to visit up here, and she was talking with us about how she and all of the indigenous leaders really had been middle-class people as they were growing up in the 1970s, but had decided to relearn Quechua and to reclaim their traditional dress and to redefine that and to transmit that to their children, most importantly. So they talk about the Otavaleños being nationally Otavaleños. They are not Ecuadorians in that sense. It has led to some tensions. The main tension in the indigenous movement is around religion. The evangelicals have tended to be much more conservative politically, and the rest of the indigenous movement, both from the jungle and the coast and the Sierra, have been much more progressive, if you will. Perhaps the most important aspect, though, has been the establishment of institutions whereby the indigenous can play a role in national politics. The most important of that is what is called CONAI, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, which allowed representation, if you will, and pressure at the central government level, and forced the rest of the political players, if you will, in Ecuador to respond to the needs of the indigenous. They have maintained themselves as a social movement, though they have a political arm as well, Pachakutik, who has representation in the Congress, and also they had representation in one of the governments in terms of 3 ministries. But basically, they still see themselves as a social movement based upon the indigenous traditions that had existed among the Quechua people. They also were successful in finding political actions that allowed them to become king breakers or king makers. Direct action, but nonviolent. The blockading of roads, was perhaps the major one, or participation in demonstrations. I happened to be in Ecuador in February of 1997, and my middle-class Quito friends said, okay, we're going to go out into the streets and demonstrate against Abdallah Bucaram. And we did. And as we were going out there, there were a group of indigenous dressed with the feathers and the loincloths and with spears, not threatening, but carrying them, who also joined this and terrified my Quiteño friends. Just the fact that they were there. To me, it was quite exciting and quite impressive that the indigenous would take that kind of a role. What they have done is actually since 1997, there has been no president who has served out his term in Ecuador, and they have played a role in virtually all of those except for the last demise of Lucio Gutierrez, which was a middle-class insurrection. So through all of this, the indigenous movement, the leaders of the indigenous movement, have maintained a sense of values, though, that are very consistent with nonviolence. Their set of values, which they really do honor, is to value family, community, collective work, dialogue, consensus, and respect for the environment. Dialogue and consensus, for example, before they take any position on a political issue, they will meet for 2 or 3 days with their bases and will discuss that, and then that will go to their leadership, and that will become the mandate. If leaders move away from them and try and go off on their own, they are quickly removed, as has happened to Antonio Vargas. So the basic point is that they have become out of the indigenous values, out of the rejection of the dominant society, out of a reclaiming of tribalism, have become a political force, but a political force that builds upon their own traditions, that perhaps in some sense is bringing about an epistemic strength, as the previous speaker talked about. So we have a positive view of what tribalism can do, what the breakdown of the national state can do. How will this play out? Ecuador on April 15th is going to elect a constituent assembly, essentially an attempt to completely redo the political structure of the country. And the indigenous will play a role in that, and it remains to be seen how important that role will be. And if they do come to play a central part in it, how and if that will change them away from those values that they have had. But at least up until now, rather than giving you the dismal news on the demise of the state and the outbreak of violence, I think that there are some reasons for hope that movements, popular movements, can indeed bring about that kind of epistemic strength.
I may need some help in getting this going. Does anyone? It seems pretty. Can someone?
It says it's locked.
Yeah, do you know how to unlock it? Okay, well, now for the dismal part. We're going to shift to the other side of the globe, to Papua New Guinea. No, that's not mine.
No.
What is it?
Go to the desktop.
Yeah, desktop, and then this one here. Okay, and then how do we get it to fill the hole? Gotcha. Great, okay. To Papua New Guinea, just above Australia. It's a country of about 5.3 million people and 800 different mutually unintelligible linguistic groups. It's a rich country. It's got a lot of timber, fish, natural gas, and oil that the Chinese have not failed to notice. It became independent in 1975 from Australia after a short period of colonization at a time when indigenous tribal political institutions were still the primary means of governance. And these indigenous tribes provided social security systems from the cradle to the grave, very, very positive in many aspects. Bride wealth, help and subsistence activities, education of children. These are young men going through the initiation at the bottom in which they were strictly educated. Care of the sick, dispute settlement, protection of rights, and very importantly, this is culture of honor, defense of honor, the right to respect property relationships, and reputation. And you can see here's a big man giving away a very dangerous bird, a cassowary, and down below is part of the fanfare of threat display before there's trouble. And so at independence, though, New Guinea, quite unlike Ecuador, it wasn't a nation, but a state in the making. And Papua New Guinea immediately rejected nationalism and sought to maintain culture and identity in what they call the Melanesian way. And they essentially sought to indigenize modernity, to turn the modern world into their system. And the Melanesian way has a number of components. First of all, they reject standard democratic voting procedures. They reject the secret ballot. This is all done in public. And they reject one man, one vote in favor of one clan, one vote. So the whole clans will pull together and vote jointly. They have a very hard time accepting representation by politicians from other tribes or ethnic groups. And politicians also will not represent other tribes or ethnic groups, but just their own. They reject the privatization of land, the obedience to formal law over the obligations of kinship. Kinship obligations come first, and the law comes second. They reject the accumulation of wealth rather than distribution of wealth. The way to make a name and to make status is to give away what you have rather than accumulate. And they reject putting national interest over local agendas. So when Australia was the colonial power, they didn't have, people of Papua New Guinea had very little interest in government, and it was just their indigenous systems that were essentially running all of the local affairs. But as soon as Australia moved out, suddenly the money from outside was up for grabs. I mean, the pig exchange was the center of life, and the big pig was the government. And so these are the changes that came about after independence. The government was seen as a source of wealth, not a source of development. The question at hand was in whose tribe or group development should take place, not what should be developed. The emphasis was on the man and not on policy, party, or politics. And public office essentially became a means to divert as much wealth as possible to one's own area and one's own supporters. There was a German who did a book on 25 of the leading men at independence. He came back to follow them up 10 years later. He found out that 80% of them were in jail for diverting wealth to their followers. And he came back another 10 years later, and he found that they were all back in office. So it's virtuous to do that. And because of this, election competition is fierce and all-consuming and is one of the sources of warfare. Could you just click on that 1 minute of DVD? I'll just get you into the spirit. If we can't do it easily, I'll wait till after. But it should come right on. This is the election. We made this film of the election in 2002 in Enga province. Is it? Yeah. If it's too much trouble, I won't waste time.
You'll have a warning in the middle to start.
Pardon?
There's a warning in the middle to start.
This is just a scene from the elections. This chaos goes on for 6 months. There are a lot of wars involved. Right now there are tens of thousands of weapons being accumulated for this event. And this may take too much time also. I don't know if that was worth it. But anyway, so now we're going to get our feet in the mud and move to Enga province in Highland. Whoops, now we have to get back to the DVD. Can you do you do that, or do I do it?
To the computer.
Computer. Sorry, to the computer, yeah. Okay, so I've gone now, somehow okay. Where am I? I can't even see what that is. Sorry, this isn't working. Yeah, okay. So anyway, with all this competition, you had a severe decline in social service, economic development and opportunities for youth, and mostly people challenged the Papua New Guinea state's monopoly on legitimate sanctioned violence as a means of keeping order. So this was a huge shift after the colonial powers left. And now we're going to move up to the case study of Enga, where I've been working on warfare for 22 years. There it is in the highlands. You might describe Enga province as heaven run by hell's angels. The first contact was in the late 1930s, and warfare, and really the first colonization in 1950s. So warfare had always been endemic in Enga province, but it was very rule-bound before contact. The players were members of tribes and a few allies. They were using locally made spears and bows and arrows. The causes were insult to injury and honor, and it was contained by a hierarchy with the elders on top who called an end to the wars after 2 or 3 deaths. And the goal was really to restore balance and honor. Then, during the colonial period, warfare was abolished by very brutal means. And then in 1975, with independence and the state unable to enforce the law, warfare resurged as a way of trying to keep order, attempted it. And you can see it resurged, but it was still very contained, because when it's not contained, you don't go to war with your umbrellas. And then this kept on. So when I started working in the 80s, it still was very controlled by the elders. And then in 1990s, guns came into the picture. Ex-police, ex-servicemen brought up their guns and introduced them to warfare. Up to that time, Enga could always get guns, but warfare was to create balance, so they didn't use them on mutual agreements. Suddenly, you had a very large structural change in Enga warfare when the gun came in. The players before had been tribesmen and relatives, allies, and a new class of local mercenaries came into the picture. The few fellows who knew how to use M16s, AK-47s, were then hired from the next tribe. The means were anywhere from guns to M16s, homemade shotguns. The cause was exactly the same as before, insult, injury, and honor. The power, though, had changed. The male hierarchy was reversed. The people say the gun speaks. It was the youth wielding the guns who had the power. And elders, then the public, could not sanction these young men because they were their defenders. So, right or wrong, no matter how much they disliked the trouble they were making, they had to support them because they were the only ones who could defend them. The competition came up to 3 levels. Before, it had always been just the opposing tribes. Now, politicians and businessmen in cities competed for status by supplying more arms to their side. So they wanted to show themselves as good, loyal, rich, successful tribal members and would send up choppers full of arms to their sides. And then the mercenaries formed opposing gangs of what people call Rambos, just like our city gangs. And these people, the Rambos, had the goal of fighting out their own vendettas in wars, so that their tribal loyalties were switched over to gang loyalties. And the goal was winning through maximal destruction. As the Enga say, you try to turn the land, the enemy land, into a wasteland cared for by the birds, snakes, and rats, to destroy everything, schools, clinics, houses, trees, and then you have won. I have some video, but I'm going to wait till the end of warfare because I think it's too disruptive. So we interviewed 16 mercenaries for days in secret places, always hiding because these people are on the run and afraid they're going to be killed. 16 mercenaries. One was a woman who wore a beautiful shell necklace. Instead of the traditional pendant, she had an M16 bullet hanging from the necklace. And this is what we found out in general about them. They had a wide range of educational attainment. They seem, all but one came from very normal family backgrounds. They were young men who started by defending their own clans, found they were great fighters, gained fame, and a job. They were also started in that age group in which young men feel that they're invulnerable, between about 15 and 25. On the one hand, they all expressed that they knew they would die, but they couldn't really envision their own deaths. And they were very influenced by American action films, and that conferred a greater sense of invulnerability. They used a lot of magic to protect themselves and believed in it. And when they fought, they described going into an altered state of being a half animal, half human. And all they wanted to do is take revenge and kill, and they couldn't eat, sleep, think straight, do anything until they had killed. On the other hand, these men were wonderful people, heroic, pro-social, loyal, generous. If they got paid for their job, they would come home and send old people to the hospital and pay school fees. Very loyal, and they shifted, though, their tribal loyalties to their gang loyalties. They were strongly indoctrinable, so there are sessions of indoctrination to dehumanize the enemy, and these people were very responsive. And they were men who were also looking for jobs when a war was over. So when they looked for jobs, there were two possibilities. One was to look for a job elsewhere in the cities or terrorist groups, or the other one is to colonize the wars of surrounding tribes so they could continue their vendetta and continue getting paid. And that's what most of them chose. And the result of this third level of competition is this credible acceleration of warfare and a population of 250,000 from the early 90s, 1991 to 1995, to 45 wars per year, to 204 in 2001 to 2006. It's absolutely huge. Now, to tie into Ken's talk, there are very many positive aspects of tribalism as well, and many of the indigenous tribes share the same community values, and they have lawyers and doctors in these tribes who formed legal associations to combat HIV/AIDS, control substance abuse, promote peace. So essentially what you have here is you have two opposing forces. Am I got the right slide here? Yes. Yeah, okay. So about 80% of the population has the positive values that Ken is talking about, and they want to strive for peace. These are some people with something to lose. About 20% have nothing to lose and seek revenge and chaos. The problem is that people will not testify or turn in those people, those 20%, because those are the people who will defend them. And there's a lot of jealousy. And if they feel that if they lose these men and they're attacked by another tribe, they're going to be lost. So the question is, will eventually the positive forces of tribalism win, as it has in Ecuador? And we've been working with this in changing the law and policy and motivating people and trying to mobilize them. And it looked very good until last week, when there was a huge settlement for a war. It was all finished, and onto the war. They ambushed the 5 peacemakers who used to be sacrosanct and just shot them dead. And that's the point, really, at which tribalism turns to terrorism. And so we don't know. The Enga have a saying that the blood of a man does not wash off easily. So, would you like to show, can I show 2 minutes of the warfare? Or, yeah, okay, some scenes from the movie we made. It's track 6. Yeah, okay, that's it.
Because in the Kurd fighting, aid posts no longer treat the victims of tribal
Thanks very much to Polly and Ken. And I'm also very grateful to them because they've actually connected up their own presentations with Professor Bilgrami's presentation. So we have laid before us a number of very important and difficult issues about the relationship between community and democracy and violence and political institutions. So it's my difficult task to try and actually manage this situation given there are so many rich ideas that have been presented to us. But perhaps we should have a few questions at this stage before we hear from the next presenters. So, Madam. And everybody who spoke, I believe, is in the room. I think Professor Bilgrami, Ken Jameson somewhere. Oh, he's left. Okay.
I would just like to ask, in regards to Papua New Guinea, with this very rapid increase of wars, whatever the definition of war is there a beginning or maybe more of a sense of frustration on the part of the larger country that it's just becoming more and more violent, more and more not functioning as any entity, and at some point, or may they reach the limit and, just absolutely say this and come down somehow. Obviously, if there's not a government that's affected, they can't come down, but what's the sentiment of the people with all this violence? And is most of the violence in the highlands? I assume it is.
It's almost all of it.
Yeah.
It's most of the highlands, but there's horrible crime and killing violence
Yeah.
in the lowlands, but not organized. But yes, people are fed up with it. And until last week, we thought this whole area that had been devastated, 30,000 refugees, everything burned to the ground. We thought they had learned their lesson. And the peace process was all set. And yet they went on and they killed these people. The government cannot do very much because the people have more high-powered weapons, they're much better fighting than the police. And when police come into the area or army, nobody will help. And so they can be asking for a certain mercenary, they can be speaking to that mercenary. I never heard of him. And nobody will tell them that that mercenary.
And is some of this a result of increased population very fast, rapidly in the last, say, 20 years?
No, because it's not, we looked at the causes and the price of them are decreasing as the population increases.
Thank you.
It has to do with developing social inequalities and globalization. That's what it's about.
Thank you. I think there's a question now from Dean.
I have a question for Akeel Bilgrami. Akeel, you said that no theoretical or perhaps practical efforts have been made as you started your talk in understanding or studying the democratization of communities rather than political institutions at local, level, national levels. And your argument is these popular movements for this new game, that's where the crux lies in perhaps altering or perpetuating that frank dichotomy. What about this study of deliberative democracy that we hear so much in political theology? Is that sort of in response to precisely this health need? Would you like to comment on that?
The concept of deliberative democracy is many things to many people. It hasn't. My own sense is that a number of these things is a matter of social practices rather than of rationality and giving reasons in a deliberative, sort of raticinative public format. I think myself that what we need to focus on is the dynamics of change in practices. Because so much, I mean, just take the context in which I raised the question about democratization of communities had to do with issues of the secular in amongst religious communities or communities, Islamic populations and minorities. My own sense is that in Islam's case, there's a lot of de facto secularity, but it's de facto. As soon as you try and make it in the realm of open public deliberation and giving of reasons, you have to say things like the Sharia is all wrong and so on, and that's just a dangerous move, right? So what we lack, I was saying, in the social scientific study of these things is a study not of questions of rationality and deliberation in the public domain, but of the dynamics by which practices can change, or there can be de facto change, which is not necessarily echoed in de jure or deliberative. And I don't think we know how to quite theorize the dynamics of changing practices.
John?
I have a question on the Ecuadorian paper. It seems to me that there are really two conceptions of the state that work. In Ecuador, the disappointment with the state has allowed for the revival of healthy communities actually not committed to violence. But over time, will that have as a consequence that they'll still have to secure resources, or will they themselves, as a regime, fall apart? That's my first part. And then in relation to the tribal violence in the highlands, if the state were a bit stronger, the capacity, say, to pay off the mercenaries, would that actually be the paradox? The stronger state would actually secure a peace, whereas ironically in Ecuador, it's the weaker state that has promoted peace.
So the second part is, in the first case, I mean, that is a tension within the indigenous movement, that they had actually, after they were instrumental in overthrowing Jameson, the next president who came in made a coalition with them. And they had an agreed-upon program, essentially a progressive social program. And this was Wiessner. And when he came in, within 3 months, he had essentially backed off of that and turned around. And so they were faced, they had three ministers, three key ministers. They had the foreign minister, a small Otavaleña, who dressed in her traditional dress, which I just love to see with Colin Powell, those guys. And the agriculture minister and minister of Bienestar Social. So they could have stayed in and fought for those resources, but they moved back and retired from the government. And so at that point, their decision was that having access to those resources by being in the ministry, the same woman that I told you about, I visited in the Ministry of Foreign Relations, and she was, in her traditional dress with all of these nice, quiteñas around her. But she did have a job there. But they decided to actually retire from the government. So you're right. At some point, that tension will come out, and it comes out most strongly within the political party, within the Pachakutik, right? But I think up until now, they have basically, many of my friends said that it was a mistake for them to go into the government for exactly that kind of a reason, that they now had access to resources and they would compromise to do that. And so I think that many of them say that it will be another 10 or 15 years before they would risk that once again. Good question.
Yeah, we've thought a lot about your question. I think that the problem is, in a democracy, I don't think the state can ever use the force against its own people that would be necessary to stop the fighting. Second of all, the people won't cooperate with the state because they see the state as something to rob of its riches, and they don't see the state as having any policy or programs that will help them. I think the only solution to this is going to be to mobilize the people and perhaps get local, well-trained policemen who belong to the people, and then try to allow the people to contain their own troublemakers.
Thank you, Polly. I think there are many more questions that could be asked, but I'm afraid we've got to continue now. We don't want to keep Martha Nussbaum waiting, and perhaps she probably won't wait anyway. So could I ask for our next presenters, George Hepner and Richard Medina from the Department of Geography. Thank you.
Switch. All right, thank you. Well, good afternoon. I'm George Hepner. My collaborator and PhD student Richard Medina pleased to be able to present to you today. Actually, it's good we had a little break for questions because we are going to change gears markedly from the previous two presentations. We're both involved in the use, the examination of terrorist networks within social and geographic space, as the title discusses, and we're taking much more of a, I guess you'd call it a technological approach, technical scientific approach to analysis of terrorist networks. So I'll turn the first few minutes over to Richard, and then I'll be back.
Okay. Our paper here provides an overview to terrorist networks and social, which is a type of virtual space, and geographical space, which is real or physical space. And we're also looking at some of the tools that we can use to analyze and visualize these networks spatially, temporally, and socially. So a brief overview. First, we will talk a little bit about network models, general network models, and models that terrorist organizations utilize. We'll move into decentralization and mostly the benefits of decentralization and why these organizations have decided to decentralize. We'll move into general social network analyses and some of the tools we can use to look at these terrorist networks. And I will turn it over to George to talk about terrorist networks and activities in real space. And finally, the analysis and visualization with geographic information systems and other tools that we have. Okay, so very generally, there are three main network models that are utilized by terrorist organizations. The first of which is the hierarchical network structure, which can be visualized as a pyramidal structure, top-down authoritative structure, and was used by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Okay. Recently, or relatively recently, we've seen a shift towards decentralized network structures, all right, where there's a lack of organizational hierarchy. Nodes determine their own path here, and as an example, you have Al-Qaeda, where the Al-Qaeda cells and operatives are trained to be self-sufficient monetarily and logistically. Okay. The final network model is the leaderless resistance, which has no real traditional social structure, but the network is held together by an ideology or a goal that's introduced by an inspirational leader. Again, an example of this can be seen with Al-Qaeda when Osama bin Laden introduces a fatwa that says all Muslims should kill all Americans, and people take up this goal. Then you see leaderless resistance come into play. And here we have a very general advanced terrorist network structure, simplified, of course. Here, within the functional core, you have the hierarchical core. Hierarchical can still remain hierarchical, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's pyramidal. Okay. Within the functional core, you have operative cells, individual operatives in here who, like I said, are trained to be self-sufficient. Outside in the periphery, you have people or organizations that are going to help with monetary or logistic resources, shelter. Okay, and then way out here outside the periphery, you're going to see those leaderless individual operatives and leaderless cells. Now, one of the main benefits of decentralization is resilience. Okay, you can't decapitate a decentralized network structure. Other benefits include quick reconfiguration, which has advantages offensively and defensively. You have the ease of movement. These cells and operatives don't have large monetary investments, and they don't build concrete infrastructures when they're moving around from place to place. And you also have the ease of transcending national boundaries, which may be crossed looking for lenient laws and regulations, also resident allies, for recruitment purposes, for other sources of funding, and shelter and other resources. So in social space, we analyze networks using traditional social network analysis. We're looking at the connectedness and structure of these networks. Traditional social network analysis focuses on the relationships and the strength of those relationships within the network. Now, relatively recently, we've seen two new mainstream approaches to network analysis, the first of which is the small world approach, which was made popular by the 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon. Okay. Also, you have the scale-free approach. Now, the small world approach is characterized by two main attributes, the first of which is high clustering, and the second of which is that you can get from any node to any other node in the network with relatively few hops through the social network, hence your 6 degrees. Okay. Now, the scale-free approach is characterized by growth and preferential attachment. Preferential attachment means that the probability of a node to gain more nodes is proportional to the amount of nodes it already has, the nodes and links and the connections it already has. So if you can imagine a network that's growing and it has preferential attachment, the earlier nodes are automatically going to have a higher probability to gain more nodes because they were there first. Okay? This leads to a hub structure where the hubs in the network dominate the network's connectivity. Okay? Now, both of these new approaches focus more on classifying these networks and the actual structure of the networks than the relationships in the network that we see with traditional social network analysis. Some of the small world and scale-free implications of networks, if we do choose to take these approaches, the first of which is that terrorist networks may only look like small worlds when necessary. The 9/11 terrorists, although they may not have kept communications all the time, they did meet and create a small world type structure for efficiency of planning and other purposes within that network. With scale-free networks, they're very resilient. In order to destroy or to damage a network, a large majority of these hubs that I talked about must be reached simultaneously before the network has a chance to rebuild. Okay? Also, the networks can vary. Decentralized networks are very dynamic. Okay? They can move around, they can migrate, they can morph into different shapes and structures. As long as those hubs aren't disturbed, they're allowed much freedom. Okay? And for both small world and scale-free implications, there's quick diffusion. The small world efficiency in diffusion is more along the lines of distance. If you can get from one side of the network to the other side with 2 or 3 hops in the network, things are going to diffuse more quickly than a hierarchical network. And when I talk about diffusion, I'm talking about propaganda, I'm talking about ideas, I am talking about resources, weapons, and funding. Okay? With the scale-free type networks, you have those hubs which, borrowing from infectious disease literature, are also termed super spreaders. If you want to quickly diffuse something through a scale-free network, you give it to the hub in the network who knows many more nodes than any random choice in the network. And also with resilience, if the majority of your nodes have very low connectivity, then if you're attacking nodes randomly, most likely you're going to get a node that really doesn't have much power in that network. Okay? Okay. And with that, I will turn it over to George.
When asked about this presentation, I wasn't quite sure how to approach this, especially in the context of the previous papers. What I thought I would do with this sort of second half of our time, the networks in geographic space, is refer a bit to the geographic aspects of the social network, but then also just to try to enlighten the audience about some of the ways that geographic analysis is used in dealing with terrorists and insurgents as networks and the incidence of their activities throughout the world. So if we look at social networks manifested in geographic space, obviously we hear a lot about the internet and other means of networking between terrorists, but quite actually, at some point, they have to, for funding sources, for training havens, for recruitment areas, for targets, they have to enter into geographic space, and they have to work within this geographic space in a dynamic way, movement and flow of money, people, information through the geographic and social networks. And so the analysis of spatial patterns, if we look at the patterns of how terrorists operate, we can then step back and hopefully get some insights into the processes that we can anticipate terrorist targets, terrorist activities, I'm going to show you some slides on terrorist havens, the potential for where terrorists might go in the future. And so hopefully with this geographic analysis, we call spatial analysis, and some tools involving maps, but much more than maps of visualization. I'll just show you these, and I think we'll handle questions at the end, and I'll give you these, and certainly you can talk to us afterwards about it. I'm not going to go into great detail. This is a social network of Afia Siddiqui. You can see her in the middle, and this is the social network. It includes not only contacts, but then geographic locations. If we map some of this first order network, we can see more realistically, rather than analyzing in a social network context like the previous slide, or looking at tabular data of who she knows and so forth, if we can take it and actually put it on a map and show the relationships between this woman who was educated at MIT and now resides in Pakistan, but had been involved in various activities. The notion of going to Africa supposedly was tied to diamonds to use to finance terrorist activities. And you can see by the different line expression, different symbology in the map, a way of conveying this social network in something that is intuitive to decision makers a little more, rather than some of the ways of portrayal. If we look at suitability for remote havens for terrorists, this is, I guess, in some ways ties to what we're talking about in a more general sense in this conference, is one of the things we'd like to do is preempt terrorists, is to look at areas of the world where they might be suitable for increased terrorist activity within geographic space. In other words, training havens, recruitment areas, relocation to geographic space, and try to identify those before the terrorists move in there in force and set up a major established infrastructure of training sites and so forth. And so what I'm taking here, and I'm not necessarily saying that these are all the factors or these are the only factors that are involved in here, but I think if you look at where terrorists need geographic space, these factors are certainly major ones in their needs. If we look at topographic factors, Tora Bora, areas of the Waziristan, these areas, areas of the jungles in South America, Shining Path, there are certain physical factors that tend to be potential havens for terrorists, also demographic and communication factors, territorial situations in terms of governance, We have effectiveness and legitimacy of local control. So these factors, these are value factors. These are support factors of having local populations, sympathetic populations. There are a number of these factors that we can map, and these factors can be put in a map form. And then by this, I cut out a lot of the intermediate slides, but to show you the most suitable are the darker tones, the least suitable potential havens for terrorists in the future are the lighter tones, and these were combined into a small-scale global map. I'll just show you South America here and point out one area that might be familiar. Obviously, the topographic factor is involved with the jungles and mountainous areas, but down here, one might not see so much of the effect of the Andes or the Amazon jungle. This area is called the tri-border area, Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And it is identified as one of the potential havens for particularly al-Qaeda terrorists in the future because of the lack of sovereignty, the lack of control over this area, because of the proximity to borders to flee across, and because of sympathetic resident populations in the region. So this is a way of geographic analysis trying to anticipate potential areas and maybe allocate resources to try to preempt. If we look at some Iraq data, and again, I just picked from work that some people have done and some of my students have done, and picked out some of the things to show you. This is incidents 2004 in Iraq, and you can see that in terms of number of incidents, it's no surprise. Baghdad has the highest number, and this is, as I say, not too surprising to us. If we look at the fatalities per incident, though, there is a different pattern. So I don't know if it's meaningful or not, but that's one of the things about doing this kind of map analysis. It leads to hypotheses, and one can then conjure up, well, is there a meaningful difference here? What is going on? And Baghdad has more incidents, but the lethality is much greater in these other cities. If we look at targets, most of the data is pretty bad in the open source. There's a lot more of it, but we don't always know what's going on. And of known targets, and you can see that the majority of these are government installations and police installations. Again, not too surprising, but I think if one looks at the different cultural, ethnic groups, religious groups within Iraq, then one gets into the sensitivities. Bruce was talking earlier about asking the people, what is it that's causing divisiveness within their community? And we oftentimes don't know in Iraq. We sort of put it to Sunni and Shia. But there are a lot of other factors that are below that. And by perhaps looking at what kinds of facilities are being attacked within particular sub-areas of Iraq, we might get a better idea of how to address those particular areas rather than thinking of Iraq as just three regions of Sunni, Shiites, and Kurds. If we look at fatalities versus incidents, just point out that this is 2004, 2005. Lots of incidents, greater number of incidents in early part of 2004, or I should say a greater number of fatalities in the early part of 2004. The number of incidents declined. I'm all grouped up here. The number of fatalities declined as we got into 2005, although the number of incidents went up. So this temporal pattern. Now, I think if we had more recent data, this would be quite different. All I can say is that I think it is important to look at things temporally and spatially in a combination, because that may give us insights into, again, looking at these patterns may give us insights to motivations and ways of preemption. If we look at the temporal analysis now broken down by days within the month and correlate those with certain events, it's not too surprising that we see the peaks where they are. But again, if one has to anticipate some of these things, I mean, Christmas seemed to be, 2005 seemed to be pretty high. Now, is that because it's symbolic to Christians? I don't know, but it leads to a hypothesis that one could pursue. If we look at this attacks over the same period of time and look at them in month and space. And I point out just the size of the pattern, the number of incidents based on the color and the size of the circle, and then the location. This obviously is being Baghdad. You can see at this time, in 2004, fairly limited number, increasing number, and the distribution is changing. Getting a few more in the south, getting a big rise in the south here, getting some up around Kirkuk, in the north, the Kurdistan, Kurdish part of Iraq. And as we get into 2005, you can see in general there is an increasing number of incidents, which the temporal analysis showed you before. But again, trying to combine various types of analysis of the data to give you insights into how things might be addressed in a better fashion than we are doing at the present. Future research, further analysis of the networks using the small world and scale-free approaches. We think that these have some valuable insights into how various networks are operating, and many other terrorist networks are copying al-Qaeda's model, if you will, and attempting to work in this decentralized fashion more. Metrics to measure types of virtual interaction, geographic, social interaction, internet interaction, so forth, and application of what we geographers call spatial interaction models, which basically spatial interaction is the movement of goods or services between entities in a network, and then improve our visualization methods for the pattern analysis and activity and analysis and visualization of the activity spaces that we call the terrorists operate within this social geographic space. Thank you.
Thank you to Richard and George. As in the case of the previous panels, we will have the next panel before we take questions. So if I could ask our next panelists, who are Cecilia, Wainryb, and Monisha Pushpakumara, to give their presentation. Thank you.
While we're switching computers, I can tell you that now we're going to turn away from discussing terrorist networks per se, and we're going to move into what Bruce Hoffman referred earlier to as the next generation, and probably the one after that as well. So we're going to switch gears now.
I think we just need visuals. So if that's audio, I don't think we need that. I don't know which one's white or.
Thank you.
It's just, okay. Where's Alita? Because we need a password.
Oh, the password is here. AT56.
Right. AT56. Tanner 2.
Oh, Tanner 2.
Okay.
Okay, so psychological research has shown that by the age of 2 or 3, that young, children are already consistently bothered by injustice and are also concerned with people being hurt physically or psychologically. And this seems to be true around the world. In fact, studies have been conducted in some South American countries such as Brazil and Colombia, in China, in Japan, India, in African countries like Zambia and Benin, and in Middle Eastern countries. And in spite of the considerable diversity in cultural and religious beliefs, children across the world tend to be concerned with the welfare of others and feel it is wrong to hurt or mistreat people. Now, this is not to say that children never hurt others or behave unfairly. They certainly do. But we know that when kids hurt others, they also struggle to make sense of their own actions. And in so doing, they further their sense of themselves as moral beings. being a moral person does not mean being a saint. Being a moral person implies the need to negotiate not only the potential for being a very good person, but also the threats implicated in one's own actions. That is, one's potential for also sometimes being a bad person or doing the wrong thing. We learn about these processes in our research by observing and analyzing how children talk about situations in which they have caused harm to others. Our research has shown that in those situations, kids consider their own needs and their own reasons for having acted the way they did, but they also consider the needs and the feelings of the people they hurt. They think about, even young kids think about how their actions affect other people, and they think about how to repair relationships. And children also, we have learned, find ways to integrate their own acts of perpetration when they hurt others within a sense of who they are. We found that kids, even very young kids, can typically acknowledge the consequences of their actions without being completely devastated by them, by what they did. And there is a sense in which kids can take this bad part of themselves and integrate it into an understanding of themselves. And they also rely on those experiences when they hurt someone to draw conclusions about their future behavior, their future self. And this essentially is the gist of what we want to see in a healthy, developing young person. Question is, what happens when to this process of developing a sense of oneself as a moral being when children are chronically exposed to political violence? We're talking about a problem of very serious proportion, and I don't have to convince this audience, actually, but in 2006, the United Nations reported that in the last decade alone, wars resulted in 15 million child refugees. Another 13 million children were displaced internally within their own countries. 6 million children were injured in wars in the last decade, and 2 million were killed. And the UN report also called special attention to the approximately 300,000 children, child soldiers around the world, children who were forced to serve in various military roles, including in killings and torture. Naturally, psychologists have been concerned about the impact of political violence on children for a long time. But psychological research has largely used a trauma model. What it means is that psychologists have been concerned with measuring the types of symptoms of post-traumatic stress that children experience as a consequence of being exposed to chronic violence. And understanding children's level of distress is obviously important, but we are also worried about other aspects of healthy personhood, such as children's ability to tell right from wrong and to view themselves as moral agents. And these aspects are not covered by PTSD measures. Our concern is that given the protracted nature of contemporary political conflicts, where violence and injustice are essentially normalized for very long periods of time, children's moral capacities may be at serious risk. In their stead, children might develop ideologies and psychological mechanisms that promote and perpetuate violence. Based on these concerns, in the last couple of years, a student of mine, Roberto Posada, who's not here today, and I have been studying displaced children in Colombia, right there, in Usme in Colombia. These are children who had been forcibly displaced from their communities due to violence perpetrated by militia groups and by guerrilla groups. Many of these kids have been separated from their parents or lost their parents. They lived in abject poverty, and they were continuously exposed to all kinds of different violence in their daily lives. Now, in spite of their truly appalling experiences, we found that these kids still develop basic moral concepts. For example, these kids will tell you that it is wrong to steal from others, that it is wrong to inflict harm on others. And this is not an insignificant finding in and of itself, given that the circumstances of their lives, if you think about it, would not seem to facilitate such learning. But while these children have conceptions of what is just and what is right and what is good, they also tend to expect that most people, themselves included, would in fact steal and get into physical fights in spite of their acknowledging that those actions would be wrong. In other words, In other words, the group of displaced Colombian children that we studied tended to construe their world as one in which nobody follows ethical principles. It is not difficult to imagine how that in such a world, the motivation to do the morally right thing may be undermined. It is also, I think, not difficult to imagine that in such a world, it would be hard to trust others or even oneself to honor commitments and to control aggressive impulses. These issues actually become particularly evident when we ask these kids to tell us about a time when they hurt somebody. And I want to show you now, I want to share with you an excerpt from a story that a displaced teenage boy told us about a time. We asked him, tell us about a time when you hurt somebody. This is a time when he hurt someone. I'll read along with you. I remember a time when we were in the classroom and the teacher left. Then I tried to hurt one of my best friends with a rope that was hanging from the roof. I put the rope around his neck. I don't know why I did it. Everybody saw that, and then they called the principal, and she began to scold me, and she told me that she might expel me from school. And then she told me that I was useless, and after that, everybody avoided me, and they made me feel like I don't belong in there, and so I felt really bad, and I cried. Now, this narrative has a couple of noteworthy features, I think, that I want to talk about. This kid is telling us about a time when he hurt one of his best friends. He put a rope around his friend's neck, not a small, insignificant event. So this kid devotes 2 or 3 short sentences to describing what he did to his friend. And then he shifts his focus completely to describing how he himself had been victimized. He was scolded, he was told he'd be expelled, he was told he was useless, everyone avoided him, and so on. It is as though for this kid, his own act of perpetration turned him into a victim. Okay? Now, this type of story was told to us by about 70% of our displaced kids. Essentially, when asked to talk about a time they had hurt somebody, these kids systematically told stories about how their perpetration turned them into victims. This type of story, by the way, rarely, if ever, appeared in our normative samples in the U.S. In fact, I don't remember even one. The other important feature of this narrative is its pervasive focus, if you sort of kind of quickly look at it. It's pervasive. I can speak into the microphone. Sorry, thank you. What was I saying? Oh, the other important feature of this narrative is its pervasive focus on observable events and behaviors, and the near total absence of references to the meanings that these behaviors may carry. This narrative, if you look at it, communicates no information about internal or mental states, such as desires, wants, thoughts, intentions. It is also devoid, in fact, of emotional language, especially in the portion that it's linked to this kid's perpetration. Now, when he switches to describing how he felt victimized, that's where he adds the only reference to internality and emotions. I felt very bad, or I felt sad. And again, this is not what we see in normative samples. Should we be concerned about this? Most definitely, yes. Typically, it is by talking about mental states, like emotions, meanings, desires, intentions, that people make sense, more or less coherently, of complex situations. It is through this type of language that people make a sequence of actions into a comprehensible event by relating their own actions to a sense of themselves and others as agents with beliefs, desires, feelings, and so on. So when this type of language is missing from a narrative, actions are essentially rendered incoherent. This kid's narrative points to avoidance and to lack of integration. It is as though this kid, a teenage boy, remember, cannot integrate a sense of himself as a wrongdoer, but he is fully aware of himself as a powerless, weeping victim. In this narrative, essentially, the impoverished language leaves this kid's behavior incomprehensible even to himself. He says, I don't know why I did it. The only clarity in this story concerns the pain he felt about his own exclusion. Now, this kid's inability to make sense of his own behavior and the juxtaposition of that senselessness, with his much more coherent pain of victimization, this juxtaposition is deeply problematic. It is deeply problematic for this individual's future welfare. As psychologists, we would be concerned about this kid as an individual. But this is also deeply problematic for us to live in a world populated by hurting adolescents who cannot make coherent sense of their own dangerous behavior, but who can see themselves very clearly as victims. So this data suggests that there is reason for concern. In fact, all this should leave us deeply concerned about the potential that political violence around the world has for undermining children's development as moral agents. And we want to argue that the disruption, the images you see are also representations of these kids' internal lives, by the way. That's what we're showing them. When we want to argue that the disruption in the development of moral capacities is likely to be even more severe for child soldiers, kids who from a very early age were forced to become instruments of killings and torture. As I said earlier, it is estimated that there are around 300,000 children around the world who are recruited into guerrilla groups and militias and terrorist groups, and this is a low estimate by all means. Lightweight automatic weapons make it easy for even very young children. We're talking about kids 7, 8, 9. Very young children to become fighters. And children are also very easy targets. They're cheap, there's many of them, they're expendable, and they're easily indoctrinated. It is widely known, in fact, that armed groups have developed brutal techniques explicitly calculated to isolate children, child soldiers, from their communities, to numb them to violence, to dehumanize their victims, and to prepare them for killing. And I want to read now, along with you, an excerpt from the book Beasts of No Nation by, and I hope I don't mispronounce it, I'm sure I mispronounced his name, Uzodinma Iweala. He's an American writer of Nigerian descent. And in this excerpt, Agu, the main character, is a child soldier from a West African country. Agu describes his first killing. Commandant is shouting, "Come here, Agu, come here right now." I am standing in my place and I am just fearing. I am not wanting to be killing anybody today. I am not ever wanting to be killing anybody. "Bloody fool," he's saying to me, "come here and bring that machete," but I am still not moving. Commandant is stepping to me and grabbing my neck. "You idiot," he's shouting. "You want to be a soldier? Well, kill him now." I am starting to crying and I am starting to shaking, and in my head I am shouting, "No, no, no," but my mouth is not moving. "Kill him," Commandant is saying in my ear, and lifting my hand with the machete, "Kill him." The enemy is saying to me, "Please don't kill me." Then he is starting to piss, and he cannot even be stopping himself. "See this man," Commandant is saying, "look at him. He's not even man. He's just going to toilet like sheep or goat or dog. If you're not killing him now, I will be thinking you're spy." He is squeezing my hand around the handle of the machete, and I am feeling the wood in my finger. "It is just like killing goat. Just bring this hand up and knock him well. He's taking my hand and bringing it down so hard on top of the enemy's head. The man is screaming louder than the sound of bullet, and then he's bringing his hand to his head. But it is not helping because his head is cracking and the blood is spilling out like milk from coconut. I am hearing laughing all around me as I am watching him trying to hold his head together. He is annoying me, and I am bringing the machete up and down and up and down. Then I am hitting his shoulder and then his chest, and looking at how Commandant is smiling each time my knife is hitting the man. in addition to being deeply disturbing, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to read it through, actually. In addition to being deeply disturbing, this is also an incredibly rich narrative. Let me point out to just some of the most telling features in this narrative. Remember what I said about our data on displaced Colombian children? As was the case with the group of displaced children, in the telling of this child soldier, we can also hear in the background a sense of normative morality. It is wrong to kill, I shouldn't kill, especially at the beginning. Here, too, the description is focused on sensory perceptual experience rather than on interpretation and meaning. And here, too, it is the perpetrator, Agu, who ends up feeling annoyed. And then more clearly even than in the Colombian narratives, the enemy here is dehumanized. So we ask, how do these children reconcile themselves with their own experience of both committing and enduring injustice and violence? How do they integrate these experiences within a sense of themselves as moral? These are not easy tasks, and I want to share with you another short piece of Agu's text. You want to put it on, Monisha? I am not bad boy. I am not bad boy. I am soldier, and soldier is not bad if he's killing. I am telling this to myself because soldier is supposed to be killing, killing, killing. So if I'm killing, then I'm only doing what is right. I am singing song to myself because I'm hearing too many voices in my head telling me I am bad boy, so I am singing. Soldier, soldier, kill, kill, kill. This is my song, and I am singing all the time, wherever we're going, to be reminding myself that I am only doing what soldier is supposed to be doing. But it is never working because I'm always feeling like bad boy. For child soldiers, the task of reconciling themselves with their experiences is particularly difficult because they must integrate their experiences of having engaged in horrifying acts of violence without denying their own moral agency, and also without adopting a sense of themselves as amoral or immoral. Now, it is not surprising that it is very common for those people who come into contact with returning child soldiers, it is very common for them to want to exonerate them. And here is an excerpt from someone totally different. This is a memoir of a child soldier, Ismail Bia, and if you read the Sunday Times, he was written up a review. There was a review of this book in the Sunday Times this past week. As a 12-year-old, this now older person, Ismail Bia, as a 12-year-old in Sierra Leone, Ismail Bia was abducted by the Revolutionary United Front. And in this excerpt that I'm going to share with you now, he speaks about his experiences 3 years later when he entered a rehabilitation camp from returning child soldiers. And this is how he describes it. When I finished telling Esther the story, she had tears in her eyes, and she couldn't, she had tears in her eyes. And she couldn't decide whether to rub my head or hug me. In the end, she did neither, but said, none of what happened was your fault. You were just a little boy. I became angry and regretted that I had told someone, a civilian, about my experience. I hated the "it's not your fault" line that all the staff members said every time anyone spoke about the war. Ismail's anger here may seem puzzling. The statement, "it was not your fault," is clearly heartfelt and well-intentioned. And yet, unwittingly, the statement, "it was not your fault," also acts so as to deny Ismail's sense of agency. And not only that, but this statement also denies Ismail's agency vis-a-vis whatever positive consequences he perceives may have resulted from his participation in this fighting group. These kids often end up very identified with whatever ideology this group holds. So denying their agency does not seem to be a good option. Having raised the alarm, I guess, having raised the alarm about the implications of exposure and participation in violence for children's moral development, one might ask whether there is any hope at all. So in closing, we want to focus on two areas where there may be capacities to call on for rehabilitating these children's sense of moral agency. And this is the work that Monisha, Pasupathi, and I are currently beginning. One of those ways involves the fact that these children, child soldiers, as well as displaced children and war-affected children. So one of the ways involves the fact that these children retain what we might call reservoirs of moral sentiment. For example, one common thread in the accounts given by the various child soldiers that we have accounts from is the depiction of strong friendships developing among them, where one child soldier will support another and help the other kid throughout their ordeal. These relationships are important because they contain in them the kinds of sentiments of care and concern that can be used to remind child soldiers not that it was not your fault what they did, but that they also acted as positive agents and that they can do so again. A second route involves helping former child soldiers to make sense of their own actions with regard to the larger political and historical conflict. Now, children try to make sense of their actions and of the events they endure without our help or intervention. Unfortunately, however, this often happens by calling upon entrenched ideologies and in-group, out-group dynamics. In some respects, this strategy works really well because, think about it, the presence of a truly evil enemy makes my own killing him sensible and right. Sadly, this kind of ideology also makes one more likely to pursue violence again. But there are ways, and this is what we're working on, there are ways to place one's own and other people's unthinkable actions within the context of a more complex understanding of the political and historical conflict, one that acknowledges the culpability and atrocities on all sides. This type of context can help a child soldier to make sense of his or her own actions without relying on polarized views of us and them, the kind of views that justify continuing violence. Ultimately, of course, the question is how to help these kids reconcile or integrate their experiences with victimization and transgression in ways that help both individuals and groups to heal. We believe, Monisha and I, that these children's stories or narratives are not only a key to understanding what's wrong, what's going wrong with children exposed to violence. These narratives are also likely to be a way to put things right. But not all stories will put things right in a sustainable way. The more sustaining stories will be those that embrace everything about these children and their place in the world, the good and the bad. The best stories will be the complicated ones, those that encompass where the children started and where they have been. And Agu, and this is what I want to end, Agu ends with a foreshadowing of that kind of story, and I'll read it along with you. And every day I am talking to Amy. She is a white woman from America who's coming here to be helping people like me. She is telling me to speak, speak, speak. I am not saying many things because I am knowing too many terrible things to be saying to you. I am seeing more terrible things than 10,000 men, and I am doing more terrible things than 20,000 men. So I am saying to her, if I am telling this to you, it will be making you think that I am beast or devil. Amy is never saying anything when I am saying this. So I am saying to her, fine, I am all of these things, but I am also having a mother once, and she is loving me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Cecilia, George, and Richard. These are two very contrasting presentations, but I think that's the whole point of the conference. And so we go from very large scale to maps of the world to the sort of interior of the human psyche in many ways. So that's the scale of what we're talking about here. And again, I'm sure there are many questions, so I welcome questions. Perhaps what we could do is first start with any questions relating to the previous two panels, and then open it up for all the panels we've heard this afternoon. Thank you. I'll try and get a microphone, please, because this is apparently being video streamed or something like that, and that requires a microphone.
Cecilia and Monisha, can you hear me? Is this on?
How's that? Is that better? Yeah. Cecilia and Monisha, I really enjoyed your talk very much, and I was struck by the thought that one of the lines of thinking that you attributed to children who are capable of violence might also turn up in another context. I'm thinking of the line that says, in which somebody thinks of themselves only as a victim and isn't capable of grasping that they themselves might be engaged in practices that cause harm to others. It seems to me that that's been a kind of rhetorical line that we've heard nationally since September 11th in this society. So I wondered if you'd like to comment on that.
Where are we being broadcast? Do you have a file already? Because I know I do. That's true. I'm already in trouble, right? I think that, and this is, I'm going to some extent out on a limb because we are psychologists and we typically deal with individuals, and now I'm saying something about the collective level, and I think there are probably many people here who know more about this. But I do think that one of the ways you can mobilize people to a cause is, of course, by highlighting their victimization and the righteousness of retaliation. And I think that's exactly what happened. I happened to do a sort of side project in the days right after 9/11, just tracking media coverage. And actually, the notion that we were at war emerged. It didn't start that way. It was being floated, and it actually kind of solidified, I think, over the course of about a week. Now, that was a very haphazard, methodologically speaking, project on my part, and I did it largely for a class demonstration. But I think you could really see that as policymakers and government officials developed an action plan, that kind of mobilization of rhetoric that would justify what we've done. And here we are 5 years later.
This is a question for Richard Medina. Where'd he go? Oh, there you are. This is about the very interesting picture you presented of structures of terrorist groups, both the hierarchical and especially the decentralized groups. And my question has to do with not how these groups function as they're engaged in various terrorist projects, but how it would be possible for them to stop doing it. Since the more decentralized a group is, the less subject, I assume, it is to top-down control or orders to desist, or and the more each of those independent nodes or cells may have its own psychology about continuing a struggle, even if some central theorists or leadership have thought it was time to. For instance, if some central theorist had argued persuasively that more damage was being done to Islam through these practices than otherwise. So how could they stop? This question is obviously also relevant to Professor Wiessner's talk and to others as well.
Okay, let me... the decentralization process is like an evolution of the organization. It's a coevolution based on the offense of other organizations like the United States, the United Nations, and they co-evolve. I don't know if you can stop the decentralization unless there's...
Not stopping the decentralization, but stopping the terrorist activities. That is, a group might change its practices. Would it be possible for these groups to actually, as it were, change? I mean, if you look at the Irish Republican Army, for instance,
Right.
it was able to change its direction.
Yeah, I think if they have, or in my opinion, I think if they feel like they have a sense of being part of the world or globalization and things like that, that they would not have to rely on violence. Am I not answering your question again? Is it? I'm sorry, I don't. Yeah.
Maybe I can shed a little light on, because obviously we don't investigate personal motivations for terrorism per se. But I think, referring to the network structure, if, you know, the target of a lot of our rhetoric and millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, is to kill Osama bin Laden. If we killed Osama bin Laden, it wouldn't change the Al-Qaeda network. And why is that? Because they are decentralized in this framework. And so I think that it isn't going, you know, and that was the point about the scale-free network and so forth, is that to try to extinguish this network, Al-Qaeda, or any similar kind of network that is this decentralized and operating as it is at present, is going to be an extremely difficult task, because there isn't a single magic bullet solution to getting rid of the spiritual leaders because they are decentralized. It does lend some ideas of certain hubs within the network might be more critical than others, and a set of limited actions of Bruce Hoffman's terms, kinetics, but also taking the support populations where these hubs happen to reside and changing their value system so that they decrease their support of the terrorist groups within that is probably the, you know, as has been suggested by people who know this topic more than me, is the ultimate solution. You know, I guess I have to beg a little bit in that we're analyzing the reality and maybe not looking at how to solve the problem as much as some of the other speakers here. But I think your question is sort of...
Well, it's really meant to be a question about how they could change themselves, their direction themselves, not how other parties, we, for instance, could change them.
Well, I think I think they're probably more...
Yes. Yes, we do have, I think, about 15 minutes, it seems to me.
So Dr. Wainryb, I'm not certain if I'm saying your name correctly. I followed that Ishmael Beale's story, too, and when I read about it, and actually a very close friend of mine knows the woman who adopted him in Brooklyn, New York, and I understood that phrase, when he first heard it, "it's not your fault," he did react to it very strongly. I mean, he wrote about it and used that, but then over time that phrase worked for his benefit, because it wasn't saying you didn't do these things, it was saying you were a child and you were indoctrinated. And it was that long-term relationship with the woman who sat with him that helped him to heal and helped him to move forward.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that comment, because, you know, "it's not your fault," to me, was used in a positive way over the long term in that setting of trying to rehabilitate those young boys.
Well, I read that too, so I know about that, and I was using this to make a point that we wanted to make about denying the non-beneficial potential of denying agency, and that is some of what's going on in rehabilitation camps, essentially. It is interesting because I spoke very briefly about the PTSD research, and we know that kids who don't feel guilty, kids who actually feel justified in what they did, show very low levels of PTSD. So by all other psychological measures, they're doing really well. But as far as their moral, we don't know what's happening to their sense of themselves as moral agents capable of doing both good and bad. And that's the question that we're asking now. That's the question that we're starting to investigate now. There is definitely, I mean, kids feel a lot better if they think they're not guilty. I mean, think about your kids. You know, my daughter, certainly the first thing she says to anything is, "I didn't do it. It was not me," right? But of course it makes you feel better. But if that's where you stay, what's going to happen? And we parents, if you think about normal life, you know, here, right, we parents talk to our kids, and we don't say just, "it was not your fault." We say, well, think about what you did and what happened and what brought you to do it and what are you going to do next time. We say a lot of other things in addition to you're just a child and you're forgiven. And that's what we're pushing for.
Thank you. My question is for George Hepner. George, you just say that I heard you and I understood you to say that ultimately the solution has to lie with sort of changing the values of the people, I think, in your comment or in your response. And my question is, the question of changing people's values is itself very complicated. Obviously, I'm sure you realize that as well. But we have another kind of problem, namely, I mean, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And I have in mind, for example, networks like the Turkish Workers' Party. You know, in Turkey, we've had a very long history of violent struggle between Kurdish separatists led by the Kurdish Workers' Party and the Turkish military, the state. For the people, 1,000 people are estimated to have died because of this. This particular network actually is very much housed, and used to be housed in Syria, Lebanon, all countries around Turkey, but also very much in Europe. And there's a lot of sympathy for the Kurdish Workers' Party in Europe. So the way that they are seen as freedom fighters vis-a-vis the oppressive Turkish state. So when we're talking about changing values, whose values exactly are we talking about? It seems to me it's a very complicated question.
We certainly agree that it is a very complicated thing. I have little problem in distinguishing between freedom fighters and terrorists. In my mind, terrorists are individuals who kill civilians, non-combatants, without regard and for some kind of political goal, whether that be wherever they happen to be in the world. And I understand the Kurds' attempt to gain. They have an ethno-nationalistic goal of getting a Kurdistan. And, you know, I understand all of that intellectually, but I think much of what they do is what I would call terrorism. I don't call it freedom fighting in the sense of someone trying to obtain their liberty. As far as the values and how to change them, I think, you know, Bruce made a good point about we don't understand the motivation, a lot of the issues associated with our greatest single terrorist foe of the present time, Al-Qaeda. And I think if we devoted more time to understanding those, more resources to that, we could certainly do that. We could develop strategies that try to address their grievances in a way that doesn't necessarily involve trying to exterminate all of them. And I think, you know, thinking this in a broader context, since you're forcing me out of my nice little analytical shell here, is that this shouldn't be that foreign to Americans. I mean, the reason we went into Europe after World War II with the Marshall Plan, because we were afraid of Nazism rearing its head again, an ideological consideration that we considered terrorism, and we spent millions of dollars, tax dollars, to do that. Why can't we identify what are the major ills of various areas of the world and devote the resources and focus within our State Department as opposed to our Defense Department, within our USAID, within our other agencies that could work on dealing with some of these issues. Now, I'm not sure we can resolve the Kurds issue, and Americans can't resolve any of these unilaterally. We're going to have to work collaboratively much more than just speaking that we're working multilaterally, but then going off on our own. There are intractable issues like Kurdistan and the wishes of the Kurds, because that territory is someone else's right now. But I think there are issues that can be resolved
And if we just work toward that and devote the resources and focus to enabling those changes to occur, we can have a positive role in this.
That's good. Perhaps a few more questions. Akeel, Leslie, and then Wayne.
This is a question addressed to the impact on children. You know, you said that part of the problem you identified was that some of these children are not deploying the vocabulary of intentions, preferences, and mentalistic conceptual vocabulary. And then you added that this was part of the reason why they were not viewing themselves as agents. But I'm wondering what step is missing here, because one could have the vocabulary of one's own desires and intentions, but see oneself as merely a product of those things and therefore not an agent at all. Right? Just sort of see oneself as a product of one's psychological causes and therefore just be precisely not an agent but an object of causality, etc. So there's some step I think that we need added to quite sort of get the picture where agency is missing. So, I mean, you want to say that self-criticism is missing, not merely that self-understanding is missing. Right? Is that the idea? And then the explanation of that might be slightly different.
I mean, you're raising, I think, a very important issue. I think we're worried about the absence of that kind of vocabulary in a very particular context, which is the context of telling a story about something you did. And it's difficult to tell a story about something you did and use that vocabulary and not position yourself as an agent acting. So I think I can imagine that I could see myself as the outcome of those things, but in the act of creating a story in which I am moving through, I think there's some way in which that storytelling context sort of puts those two things together, that vocabulary and the kind of agentic perspective. But I'm not sure that's, I'm not sure that's an entirely defensible position. I think it's kind of an interesting question.
It's just that a step seems to be missing. I mean, I can see that you want to say that having a story about yourself increases agency, but the fact is having a story about yourself could also just be a very passive thing. So it's not as if I don't agree with you, I just want the missing step.
A quick response.
Yeah, I find in the interviews that I do, one of the big differences between, I work with the Bushmen and with the Angan New Guinea, is that here in the West, we look at identity as chosen. We choose our identity, we're agents, we select it. But in other societies, and I work with Japanese who say the same thing, identity is assigned to you by the group. It's not chosen, it's not your choice. And so that may affect the stories to quite a degree if you see your identity as something you choose and constitute, and if you see it as something that other people attribute to you.
Except, Holly, that we have data on juvenile delinquents in this country. Sorry. We have data on juvenile delinquent stories. Kids, juvenile delinquents tell us stories about what they did and how they did it and what happened, and how they got in trouble and so on. And those stories sound very much in the lack of internality, sound very much like these stories, and they are, good American kids. Well, good, I don't know, but definitely American kids. So
Your identity may be assigned here.
well, but then it's not cultural. I mean, it's got to be some other sense of how we direct our lives, and maybe there is a sense in which we lose that sense of agency when we are engaged in these kinds of immoral or not sanctioned behaviors or something like that.
Thanks, Cecilia. Two quick questions to conclude with. So if Leslie could ask a question, then Wayne could ask his question. Where is the
You don't have to. This is actually an observation about what's been so interesting about bringing the social scientists and the philosophers together. Marilyn said this morning that she was interested in justificatory questions, not explanatory questions. And part of what you were doing, I think, was looking at how almost what's therapeutic or descriptive accounts of how explanations turned back into justifications. That's an observation about linkages, and I think it would be an enormously interesting question to go for further work.
Well, perhaps that's an appropriate note to end on. So I think all that's left for us is Wayne waived his question as it were. So let us all just thank the panelists for wonderful presentations.